Hi everyone, how are you today? Let's learn psychology with me, Bertie. Let's talk about the physical and cognitive development in adolescence. Growth during adolescence. The rapid pace of physical and sexual maturation. Adolescence is the developmental stage that lies between childhood and adulthood. It is a transitional stage. One aspect of this transformation is the adolescent growth spurt, a period of very rapid growth in height and weight. On average, boys grow 4.1 inches a year and girls 3.5 inches a year. Some adolescents grow as much as 5 inches in a single year. Boys and girls' adolescent growth spurts begin at different times. Girls begin their spurts around age 10, while boys at about age 12. During the 2-year period starting at age 11, girls tend to be taller than boys. But by the age of 13, boys, on average, are taller than girls. Puberty. Puberty is the period during which the sexual organs mature. Begins when the pituitary gland in the brain signals other glands in children's bodies to begin producing the sex hormones, androgens, male hormones, or estrogens, female hormones. Androgens, male hormones, or estrogens, female hormones. At adult levels. Males and females produce both types of sex hormones, but males have a higher concentration of androgens and females have a higher concentration of estrogens. The pituitary gland also signals the body to increase production of growth hormones that interact with the sex hormones to cause the growth spurt and puberty. The hormone leptin appears to play a role in the start of puberty. Remember, the hormone leptin. Like the growth spurt, puberty begins earlier for girls than for boys. Girls start puberty at around age 11 or 12, and boys begin at around age 13 or 14. However, there are, of course, different variations across individuals. For example, some girls begin puberty as early as 7 or 8, or as late as 17 years of age. Puberty in girls. The environmental and cultural factors play a role in puberty in girls. For example, menarche, I'm not sure, the onset of menstruation, and probably the most obvious signal of puberty in girls, varies greatly in different parts of the world. In poorer developing countries, menstruation begins later than in more economically advantaged countries. Even within wealthier countries, girls in more affluent groups begin to menstruate earlier than less affluent girls. It appears that girls who are better nourished and healthier are more apt to start menstruation at an earlier age than those who suffer from malnutrition or chronic disease. Some studies have suggested that weight or the proportion of fat to muscle in the body might play a critical role in the timing of menarche. Conversely, obesity, which results in an increase in the secretion of leptin, a hormone associated with the onset of menstruation, leads to earlier puberty. Other factors can also impact the timing of menarche. For example, Environmental stress, due to such factors as parental divorce or high levels of family conflict, can bring about an early onset. Secular trend is a pattern of change occurring over several generations. The earlier start of puberty is an example of a significant secular trend, a pattern of change occurring over several generations. Secular trend. Secular trends occur when a physical characteristic changes over the course of several generations, such as earlier onset of menstruation or increased height that has occurred as a result of better nutrition over the centuries. Primary sex characteristics are associated with the development of the organs and structures of the body that directly relate to reproduction. In contrast, secondary sex characteristics are the visible signs of sexual maturity that do not involve the sex organs directly. In girls, the development of primary sex characteristics involves change in the vagina and uterus. Secondary sex characteristics include the development of breasts and pubic hair. Breasts begin to grow at around the age of 10, and pubic hair begins to appear at about age 11. Underarm hair appears about 2 years later. Puberty in boys. The penis and scrotum begin to grow at an accelerated rate around the age of 12, and they reach adult size about 3 or 4 years later. As boys' penises enlarge, other primary sex characteristics are developing, with enlargement of the prostate gland and seminal vesicles, which produce semen, the fluid that carries sperm. A boy's first ejaculation, known as spermache, usually occurs around the age of 13, more than a year after the body has begun producing sperm. At first, the semen contains relatively few sperm, but the amount of sperm increases significantly with age. Secondary sex characteristics are also developing. Pubic hair begins to grow around the age of 12, followed by the growth of underarm and facial hair. Finally, boys' voices deepen as the vocal cords become longer and the larynx larger. The surge in production of hormones that triggers the start of adolescence may also lead to rapid swings in mood. For example, boys may have feelings of anger and annoyance that are associated with higher hormone levels. In girls, the emotions produced by hormone production are somewhat different. Higher levels of hormones are associated with anger and depression. Both boys and girls then can experience anger. How about body image in adolescence? Some of the changes of adolescence do not show up in physical changes, but carry psychological weight. In the past, girls tended to react to menarche with anxiety because Western society tended to emphasize the more negative aspect of menstruation, such as the potential of cramps and messiness. Today, however, the society's view of menstruation is more positive, partly because menstruation has been demystified and discussed more openly. For instance, TV commercials for tampons are commonplace now. As a consequence, menarche is typically accompanied by an increase in self-esteem, a rise in status, and greater self-awareness, as adolescent girls see themselves as becoming adults. A boy's first ejaculation is roughly equivalent to menarche in a girl. Boys rarely mention their first ejaculation to their parents or even their friends. Teenagers entering puberty frequently are embarrassed by the changes that are occurring. Girls are often unhappy with their new bodies. Ideals of beauty in many Western countries call for an unrealistic thinness quite different from the actual shape of most women. Puberty brings a considerable increase in the amount of fatty tissue, as well as enlargement of the hips and demand. How children react to the onset of puberty depends in part on when it happens. Girls and boys who mature either much earlier or later than most of their peers are especially affected by the timing of puberty. The timing of puberty, early or late. Let's talk about early maturation. For boys, early maturation is largely a plus. They tend to be more successful at athletics because of their larger size. They also tend to be more popular and have a more positive self-concept. It also has a downside though. Boys who mature early are more apt to have difficulties in school. They are also more likely to become involved in delinquency and substance abuse. Why? Because their larger size makes it more likely that they will seek out the company of older boys who may involve them in activities inappropriate for their age. This is a different case for early maturing girls. For early maturing girls, the obvious changes in their bodies, such as development of breasts, may lead them to feel uncomfortable and different from their peers. Moreover, in general, mature earlier than boys. Girls in general mature earlier than boys. Early maturation tends to come at a very young age in the girl's life. Early maturing girls may have to endure ridicule from their less mature classmates. It's not a completely negative experience for girls, though. Girls who mature early tend to be sought after more as potential dates, and their popularity may enhance their self-concept. Even though they may not be so confident, the early maturation may bring a positive self-concept for them. It also has a price. The attention has a price. They may not be socially ready to participate in the kind of one-on-one dating situations that most girls deal with at a later age. And such situations may be psychologically challenging for early maturing girls. Moreover, the conspicuousness of their deviance from their later maturing classmates may have a negative effect, producing anxiety, unhappiness, and depression. Cultural norms and standards regarding how women should look play a big role in how girls experience early maturation. For instance, in the US, the notion of female sexuality is looked upon with a degree of ambivalence, being promoted in the media yet frowned upon socially. Girls who look sexy attract both positive and negative attention. In turn, Unless a young girl who has developed secondary sex characteristics early can handle the disapproval she may encounter, the outcome of early maturation may be negative. In countries in which attitudes about sexuality are more liberal, the results of early maturation may be more positive. For example, in Germany, which has a more open view of sex, early maturing girls have higher self-esteem than those in the US. It also depends on the views of girls' peers groups and on prevailing community standards regarding sex. How about late maturation? For late maturation, the case for boys are actually worse than for girls. Boys who are smaller and lighter than their more physically mature peers tend to be viewed as less attractive. They are at a disadvantage when it comes to sports activities. They are expected to be bigger than their dates, so the social lives of late maturing boys may suffer. If the difficulties in adolescence lead to a decline in self-concept, the disadvantages of late maturation for boys could extend well into adulthood. On the other hand, coping with the challenges of late maturation may actually help males in some ways. Late maturing boys grow up to have several positive qualities, such as assertiveness and insightfulness. For late maturing girls, it's actually more positive. They may be overlooked in dating and other mixed sex activities during junior high school and middle school, and they may have relatively low social status. However, by the time they are in the 10th grade and have begun to mature visibly, late maturing girls' satisfaction with themselves and their bodies may be greater than those of early maturers. Late maturing girls may end up with fewer emotional problems. The reason they are able to fit to societal idea of a slender, leggy body type than early maturers, who tend to look heavier in comparison. In summary, there are both positive and negative sides of late and early maturation in adolescence. We also have to think about other factors such as changes in peer groups, family dynamics, and schools and other societal institutions that may be more pertinent in determining an adolescent's behavior than early and later maturation and the effects in puberty in general. Nutrition, food, and eating disorders. Problems for the growth of adolescents. Obesity. The most common nutritional concern during adolescence is obesity. Obesity taxes the circulatory system, increasing the likelihood of high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes. Lack of exercise is the main culprit. There are additional reasons for the high rate of obesity during adolescence. For example, the availability of fast food, which deliver large portions of high-calorie, high-fat cuisine at prices adolescents can afford. Additionally, they also spend a lot of time on their social media, watching TV, and also play video games, accompanied by snacks or junk food. Anorexia nervosa and bulimia. Anorexia nervosa is a severe eating disorder in which individuals refuse to eat, while denying that their behavior and appearance, which may become skeletal, are out of the ordinary. Basically, they don't want to eat, they refuse to eat, and they also deny that their body is skeletal, that they're very thin. Anorexia is a dangerous psychological disorder. Some 15 to 20% of its victims literally starve themselves to death. It primarily afflicts women between the ages of 12 and 40. Those most susceptible are intelligent, successful, and attractive white adolescent girls from affluent homes. Even though they eat little, individuals with anorexia are often focused on food. They may go shopping often, collect cookbooks, talk about food, or cook huge meals for others. Although they may be incredibly thin, their body images are so distorted that they see their reflections in mirrors as fat and try to lose more and more weight. Even when they look like skeletons, they are unable to see what they have become. Bulimia. It's an eating disorder characterized by binges on large quantities of food, followed by purges of the food through vomiting or the use of laxatives. People with bulimia may eat an entire gallon of ice cream or a whole package of tortilla chips. But after such a binge, sufferers experience powerful feelings of guilt and depression. And they intentionally rid themselves of the food. Although the weight of a person with bulimia remains fairly normal, the disorder is quite hazardous. The constant vomiting and diarrhea of the binge and purge cycles may produce a chemical imbalance that can lead to a heart failure. Dieting often precedes the development of eating disorders, as even normal weight individuals are spurred on by societal standards of slenderness to seek to lower their weight. Girls who mature earlier than their peers and who have a higher level of body fat are more susceptible to eating disorders during later adolescence, as they try to bring their maturing bodies back into line with the cultural standard of a thin boy's physique. Adolescents who are clinically depressed are also more likely to develop eating disorders later. A biological cause lies at the root of both anorexia nervosa and bulimia. Twin studies indicate that there are genetic components to the disorders. Additionally, hormonal imbalances sometimes occur in sufferers. Other attempts to explain the eating disorders emphasize psychological and social factors. Disorders are a result of perfectionist, over-demanding parents or byproducts of other family difficulties. Culture also plays a role. Anorexia nervosa, for example, is found only in cultures that idolize slender female bodies. Because in most places, such a standard does not hold, anorexia is not prevalent outside the US. For example, anorexia is quite rare in Asia, with two interesting exceptions. The upper classes of Japan and Hong Kong, where Western influence is greatest. Because these two eating disorders are products of both biological and environmental causes, treatment typically involves a mix of approaches. For example, both psychological therapy and dietary modifications are likely to be needed for successful treatment. Hospitalization may be necessary in more extreme cases. Brain development and thought in adolescence. Adolescence brings greater independence. There is a lot of cognitive abilities during adolescence that actually are developing. As the number of neurons, the cells of the nervous systems, continue to grow, their interconnections become richer and more complex. Adolescent thinking also becomes more sophisticated. The brain produces an oversupply of gray matter during adolescence, which is later pruned back at the rate of 1 to 2% per year. Myelination, the process in which nerve cells are insulated by a covering of fat cells, increases and continues to make the transmission of neural messages more efficient. Both the pruning process and increased myelination contribute to the growing cognitive abilities of adolescents. One specific area of the brain that undergoes development throughout adolescence is the prefrontal cortex, which is not fully developed until around the early 20s. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that allows people to think, evaluate, and make complex judgments in a uniquely human way. It underlies the increasingly complex intellectual achievements possible during adolescence. During adolescence, the prefrontal cortex becomes increasingly efficient in communicating with other parts of the brain. This helps build a communication system within the brain that is more distributed and sophisticated, permitting the different areas of the brain to process information more effectively. The prefrontal cortex also provides more impulse control. Rather than simply reacting to emotions such as anger or rage, an individual with a fully developed prefrontal cortex is able to inhibit the desire for action that stems from such emotions. Because during adolescence, the prefrontal cortex is biologically immature, the ability to inhibit impulses is not fully developed. This brain immaturity may lead to some of the risky and impulsive behaviors that are characteristic of adolescence. Okay, my understanding is that the prefrontal cortex undergoes considerable development through adolescence, but it's not fully developed. It undergoes a lot of developments, but it's not fully developed yet. Some researchers theorize that not only do adolescents underestimate the risk of risky behavior, but they also overestimate the rewards that will come from the behavior. Regardless of the causes of risk-taking in adolescence, it has led to a heated discussion of whether the death penalty should be applied to adolescents. The immature brain argument. Among the facts that the Supreme Court weighed in its decision was evidence from neuroscientists and child developmentalists that the brains of adolescents are still developing in important ways, and that therefore they lack judgment because of this brain immaturity. According to this reasoning, adolescents are not fully capable of making reasonable decisions because their brains are not yet wired like those of adults. The argument that adolescents may not be responsible for their crimes as adults stem from research showing that the brain continues to grow and mature during teenage years and sometimes beyond. For example, neurons that make up unnecessary gray matter of the brain begin to disappear during adolescence. In their place, the volume of white matter of the brain begins to increase. The decline in gray matter and the increase in white matter permit more sophisticated, thoughtful cognitive processing. Are the brains of adolescents so immature that teenage offenders should receive less harsh punishment for their crimes than those with older and therefore more mature brains? It's not a simple question, and the answer are probably going to be more from those studying morality than from scientists, according to the textbook. Sleep deprivation. The sleep deprivation comes at a time when adolescents' internal clocks shift. Although adolescents in particular experience the need to go to bed later and to sleep later in the morning, and they require 9 hours of sleep each night to feel rested. Yet, half of adolescents sleep 7 hours or less each night, and almost 1 in 5 gets less than 6 hours. Sleep deprivation takes its toll. Sleepy teens have lower grades, are more depressed, and have greater difficulty controlling their moods. They are also at great risk for car accidents. Cognitive development and schooling. Adolescents are able to keep a variety of abstract possibilities in their heads and can see issues in relative as opposed to the absolute terms. They are capable of perceiving shades of gray and not just black and white. Piagetian approaches to cognitive development using formal operations. The formal operational stage is the stage at which people develop the ability to think abstractly. Piaget suggested that people reach this stage at the start of adolescence around the age of 12. By bringing formal principles of logic to bear on problems they encounter, adolescents are able to consider problems in the abstract rather than only in concrete terms. They can test their understanding by systematically carrying out rudimentary experiments on problems and situations, and observing what their experimental interventions bring about. Adolescents can use formal reasoning, in which they start with a general theory about what produces a particular outcome and then deduce explanations for specific situations in which they see that particular outcome. What distinguishes this kind of thinking from earlier cognitive stages is the ability to start with abstract possibilities and move to the concrete, while in previous stages, children are tied to the concrete here and now. Adolescents can also employ propositional thought during the formal operational stage. Propositional thought is reasoning that uses abstract logic in the absence of concrete examples. Reasoning that uses abstract logic in the absence of concrete examples. For example, propositional thinking allows adolescents to understand that if certain premises are true, then a conclusion must also be true. For example, all teachers are mortal. Miss Gonzalez is a teacher. Therefore, Miss Gonzalez is mortal. Not only can adolescents understand that if both premises are true, then so is the conclusion, but they're also capable of using similar reasoning when premises and conclusions are stated more abstractly, as follows. All S are B, C is an A, therefore C is a B. Adolescence gradually unfold through a combination of physical maturation and environmental experiences. According to Piaget, it's not until adolescents are around 15 years old that they are fully settled in the formal operational stage. One of the reasons adolescents differ in their use of formal operations relates to the culture in which they were raised. For example, people who live in isolated, scientifically unsophisticated societies and who have little formal education are less likely to perform at the formal operational level than formally educated people living in more technologically sophisticated societies. A more probable conclusion is that the scientific reasoning that characterizes formal operations is not equally valued in all societies. What are the consequences of adolescents' use of formal operations? Their increased abstract reasoning abilities may lead them to question their parents and other authority figures far more strenuously. Advances in abstract thinking also lead to greater idealism, which may make adolescents impatient with imperfections in institutions such as schools and the government. Generally, adolescents become more argumentative. They enjoy using abstract reasoning to poke holes in others' explanations, and their increased abilities to think critically make them acutely sensitive to parents' and teachers' perceived shortcomings. For example, they note the inconsistency of their parents' arguments against using drugs, such as when they know that their parents used drugs when they were adolescents. nothing much came of it. At the same time, adolescents can also be indecisive, as they are able to see the merits of multiple sides to issues. Coping with the increased critical abilities of adolescents can be challenging for parents, teachers, and other adults. But it also makes them interesting as they actively seek to understand the values and justifications that they encounter in their lives. There are some critics to Piaget's approach, though. For example, Piaget suggests that cognitive development proceeds in universal, step like advances that occur at particular stages. Yet, we find significant differences in cognitive abilities from one person to the next, especially when we compare individuals from different cultures. The notion of stages proposed by Piaget suggests that cognitive abilities do not grow gradually or smoothly. Instead, the stage point of view implies that cognitive growth is typified by relatively rapid shifts from one stage to the next. On the contrary, many developmentalists argue that cognitive development proceeds in a more continuous fashion, increasing not so much in qualitative leaps forward as in quantitative accumulations. They also contend that Piaget's theory is better at describing behavior at a given stage than explaining why the shift from one stage to the next occurs. Piaget also underestimated the age at which certain capabilities emerge. It is now widely accepted that infants and children are more sophisticated at an earlier age than Piaget asserted. Piaget had a relatively narrow view of what is meant by thinking and knowing. Some developmentalists argue that formal operations do not represent the epitome of thinking, and that more sophisticated forms of thinking do not actually emerge until early adulthood. Instead, a kind of thinking is required that is flexible, allows for interpretive process, and reflects the fact that reasons behind events in the real world are subtle, something called post-formal thinking. Let's see it from information processing perspectives. Gradual transformations in abilities. The information processing perspective sees changes in adolescents' cognitive abilities as evidence of gradual transformations in the capacity to take in, use, and store information. A number of progressive changes occur in the ways people organize their thinking about the world, develop strategies for dealing with new situations, sort facts, and achieve advances in memory capacity and perceptual abilities. Adolescents' general intelligence remains stable, but there are dramatic improvements in the specific mental abilities that underlie intelligence. Verbal, mathematical, and spatial abilities increase, making many adolescents quicker with a comeback, impressive sources of information, and accomplished athletes. Memory capacity grows and they become more adept at effectively dividing their attention across more than one stimulus at a time. They can simultaneously study for a biology test and listen to music. Piaget noted that they grow increasingly sophisticated in their understanding of problems, their ability to grasp abstract concepts, and to think hypothetically, and their comprehension of the possibilities inherent in situations. This permits them to endlessly dissect the course that their relationship might hypothetically take. Adolescents know more about the world too. Their store of knowledge increases as the amount of material to which they are exposed grows and their memory capacity enlarges. The mental abilities that underlie intelligence show a marked improvement during adolescence. According to information processing explanations of cognitive development during adolescence, one of the most important reasons for advances in mental abilities is the growth of metacognition. Metacognition, what is that? Metacognition is the knowledge that people have about their own thinking processes and their ability to monitor their cognition. Although school-age children can use some metacognitive strategies, adolescents are much more adept at understanding their own mental process. For example, as they improve their understanding of their memory capacity, they get better at gauging how long they need to study a particular kind of material to memorize it for a test. These new abilities can also make adolescents more introspective and self-conscious. This may produce a high degree of egocentrism. Egocentrism in thinking. Adolescents' self-absorption. Adolescent egocentrism is a state of self-absorption in which the world is viewed as focused on oneself. A state of self-absorption in which the world is viewed as focused on oneself. This egocentrism makes adolescents highly critical of authority figures, such as parents and teachers, unwilling to accept criticism, and quick to find fault with others' behavior. The kind of egocentrism we see in adolescents helps explain why they sometimes perceive that they are the focus of everyone else's attention. They develop what has been called imaginary audience, fictitious observers who pay as much attention to the adolescent's behavior as adolescents do themselves. Imaginary audience. An adolescent's belief that his or her own behavior is a primary focus of others' attention and concerns. The imaginary audience is usually perceived as focusing on the one thing that adolescents think most about: themselves. Unfortunately, these scenarios may suffer from the same kind of egocentrism as the rest of their thinking. For example, a student sitting in a class may be sure a teacher is focusing on her, and a teenager at a basketball game is likely to be convinced that everyone around is focusing on the pimple on his chin. Egocentrism leads to a second distortion in thinking, the notion that one's experiences are unique. Adolescents develop personal fables. Personal fables. The view that what happens to them is unique, exceptional, and shared by no one else. Personal fables. For example, teenagers whose romantic relationships may have ended may feel that no one has ever experienced the hurt they feel, that no one has ever been treated so badly, that no one can understand what they are going through. Personal fables may also make adolescents feel invulnerable to the risks that threaten others. Much of adolescents' risk-taking may well be traced to the personal fables that they construct for themselves. They may think that there is no need to use condoms during sex because in the personal fables they construct, pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections such as AIDS only happen to other kinds of people, not to them. They may drive after drinking because their personal fables paint them as careful drivers, always in control. School performance. Independent measures of achievement such as SAT scores, SAT scores in the US have not risen. Consequently, a more likely explanation for the higher grades is the phenomenon of grade inflation. According to this view, it is not that students have changed. Instead, instructors have become more lenient, awarding higher grades for the same performance. This is a proof that uh, the advances that occur in metacognition, reasoning, and other cognitive abilities during adolescence don't always translate into improvement in school performance. If grades are used to measure, the clear answer is yes, but it's not always the case. Socioeconomic status affects the school performance. Children living in poverty lack many of the advantages enjoyed by other children. Their nutrition and health may be less adequate. Often, living in crowded conditions and attending inadequate schools, they may have few places to do homework. Their homes may lack the books and computers commonplace in more economically advantaged households. As they grow older, their school performance may continue to lag and their disadvantage may snowball. Ethnic and racial differences in school achievement. On average, African American and Hispanic students tend to perform at lower levels, receive lower grades, and score lower on standardized tests of achievement than Caucasian students. On the contrary, Asian American students tend to receive higher grades than Caucasian students. Anthropologist John Ogu argues that members of certain minority groups may perceive school success as relatively unimportant. They may believe that societal prejudice in the workplace will dictate that they will not succeed, no matter how much effort they expend. Their conclusion is that hard work in school will have no eventual payoff. He suggests that members of minority groups who enter a new culture voluntarily are more likely to be successful in school than those who are brought into a new culture against their will. Another factor in the differential success of various ethnic and racial group members has to do with attributions for academic success. Students from many Asian cultures tend to view achievement as the consequence of temporary situational factors, such as how hard they work. In contrast, African American students are more apt to view success as the result of external causes over which they have no control, such as luck or societal biases. Thank you so much for studying psychology with me. See you next time.